All right, hello everybody. I'm Yuval Levin of the American Enterprise Institute, and it's really my pleasure to welcome you to a conversation with Dennis Hale and Marc Landy about their very important new book, Keeping the Republic. The United States Constitution and the political order that it created have a lot of critics and opponents just now. Sometimes it can seem like they have only critics and opponents, and yet that political order is our civic home. It's been embodied for more than 2 centuries in a living democratic republic, the oldest of the existing democracies, and in a lot of ways still the most vibrant and dynamic. That living Republican order makes the case for itself in practice, but it is surely also essential to make that case in speech when we can, to answer the critics of American constitutionalism, to help Americans understand the virtues of our system, and to see for ourselves how our practice of constitutionalism might be improved, how our system might be strengthened. Dennis Hale and Marc Landy have stepped forward to do just that in a superb, important new book that you really have to read. That book is the subject of our conversation over the coming hour. Dennis Hale and Marc Landy are both professors of political science at Boston College. They're both noted scholars of American politics. Dennis has written, among many other important things, a very important book on the jury system I very much recommend to you, called The Jury in America. Marc has written so much that I could point you to. Maybe for our purposes, it's particularly important to note that he's the co-author of Presidential Greatness, a book that, again, you really have to read to understand American political life. They've also both written for National Affairs, most importantly, of course, the quarterly journal that we publish here at AI. The concerns and arguments of this new book have been present in their writing for a long time, but they bring them together here in a very powerful and illuminating way, and at a very important moment to join the debate about American constitutionalism. This conversation is, for us here at AI, part of an ongoing series that we call the Edward and Helen Heinz Book Forums. These are public conversations about books with real significance for American life, written both by AI scholars and by outsiders. We're very grateful to the Heinzes for their support of this series and for their longstanding support of everything we do at AI. Our format this afternoon is going to be very simple. Marc and Dennis are going to speak about the book for a little bit, and then I will put some questions to them, and we'll enter into a conversation about the book, and then we'll draw all of you into that conversation and talk together about American constitutionalism. For those of you watching live online, we would love to have you in the conversation too, and you can see on the page where you're watching us how to pose your questions in a way that they can reach us. And with that, gentlemen, the floor is yours.
Well, thanks so much, Yuval. It's really such a pleasure to be at AI. I devour you guys' work, and particularly his, but there are others of you as well whose faces I don't recognize, but I'm really glad to learn who you are. Just 1 second before I begin. Clock. The Constitution is broken and should not be reclaimed. That's the headline from a New York Times op-ed written by a Harvard and a Yale law professor. And this is only the most hyperbolic example of a point of view that has become increasingly prominent in the writings of law professors, journalists, I'm sad to say political scientists. The Constitution is not only broken, but paralyzing, undemocratic, obsolete. These critics abhor such non-democratic constitutional elements as the Electoral College, the Senate, the amendment process, the presidential veto, and the lifetime appointment of Supreme Court justices. But underlying these complaints is a deep critique of the spirit of the Constitution and of the massive republic which it founded. That spirit, indeed America itself, is said to be inherently undemocratic, fostering excessive individualism, greed, inequality, and corruption. Because the nation's founders indulged in the institution of slavery, the Constitution itself is often said to be an instrument of exploitation. It is insufficiently protective of rights, and because it is so difficult to amend, it forces the living to be governed by the dead. Central error of the critique is the mistaken supposition that America should be a majoritarian democracy rather than the mitigated democracy created by the Constitution. Critics imply that if all the obstacles to majority rule the Constitution establishes were removed, the American people would be freer and better governed. But the Constitution mitigates, not because it wishes to oppose popular rule, but because it seeks to discipline popular rule by restraining public action. It erects hurdles, not barriers, and it constrains democracy in order to discourage impulsive democracy. The notion that majorities should just obtain their goals in real time. As the book that you're all welcome to buy, even Grieva can buy himself a copy. As the book demonstrates, it's not just contemporary scholars of the ilk that I've described that have this kind of profound critique. That dates back as far as the Anti-Federalists and is present in the writings of such critical voices as Henry David Thoreau, William Lloyd Garrison, Edward Bellamy, Herbert Crowley, Theodore Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, some of FDR's brain trusters, but I'm glad to say not all, and the New Left thinkers who emerged in the 60s. The central argument of this paper, it's not a paper, the central argument of this talk derives from the simple proposition that Constitution provides for a free government because it limits the exercise of power. This is an essential ingredient of any good government, even one that aims at popular government. The people should rule is a given among modern Republicans. Some ancient Republicans wouldn't be so happy. That the people can do anything they want is a proposition that no sane person can believe. Thus, the limits that the Constitution places on American politics are not a problem, but a response to a problem. That problem we define more precisely as the difficulty, even the danger, of popular government in a massive modern state. The United States was the first government to attempt this. The problem posed by the modern state stemmed from modernity itself as a way of thinking and being in the world. We contend that the American constitutional framework embodies a measured and wise response to those problems of that time and remains the best framework for coping with the problems of modernity today. This is not just a scholarly argument, this is an argument about the contemporary situation. We treat the framers as men who understood many of the problems that modernity brings with it and who thought very carefully about how to deal with those problems, how to embrace modernity without simply embracing it, in order to tame it. The following are the most politically relevant attributes of modernity. This is not a broad discussion of modernity. This is just as it impinges on politics. In a modern state, no person can, without fear of ridicule, claim to be better than another as a matter of birth. Equality is the rule. The public sphere rank does not have its privileges. Claims of superiority are only considered valid if they are based on a rational principle, merit. Of course, equality and merit are often honored in the breach, but such hypocrisy does not undermine the compelling nature of such claims. The modern state is enormous in scale. It's true that there are also small states in the world, but those exist at the sufferance of the large ones and could easily be conquered if the big ones chose to. The US is not Switzerland or Athens, Dustin. It's not Athens either. But then neither is France, England, Russia, Japan, or any of the modern states that have smaller populations than the United States. Before the modern period, large political entities were empires rather than nations, and they lacked the level of political integration, stable borders, and administrative control that modern states enjoy. Self-government is not possible in an empire. Scale means not just acreage, but people. And large populations are more even important than large territories. It's inevitable that the vast populations of modern states will bring diversity with them. Modern states, therefore, typically encompass many different ethnic, cultural, racial, religious groups. Sometimes these diverse elements are separated into different regions and locales, but often they are intermingled, and not always harmoniously. Nations as different as Canada, Nigeria, the United States, and India have experienced conflict, sometimes violent, between groups of citizens whose differences of ethnicity, religion, language were stronger than their commitment to a common national home. Among the large modern states, only Japan is ethnically, culturally, and racially homogeneous, although Chinese are moving there, I read in the New York Times yesterday. When polities were small, as they were in the ancient republics and in the American colonies, direct rule by the people was at least possible. All the citizens of Athens or a small New England township could gather in one place and deliberate among themselves as to how to address issues of common concern. Because their numbers were small, citizens had the chance to speak and be heard. Yet because the modern state numbers in the tens or hundreds of millions, direct participation is impossible except for a small fraction. Each citizen comes to compose an infinitesimal fraction of the whole. Not only does this place practical limits on direct participation, but it makes it also very difficult to resist the conclusion that any one individual is simply too insignificant to matter politically, and therefore one may readily become passive. Because all modern states claim to rule in the name of the people. Those who belong to it are called citizens, not subjects, as they would in a monarchy. And yet arithmetic reality threatens to turn them into subjects, in fact, if not in name. Thus, the claim of popular sovereignty does not per se protect against autocratic rule. In modern states, populations are not just large and diverse, they're highly mobile. Indeed, states like Brazil, India, Pakistan, Nigeria, that lack many attributes of modernity, but have experienced vast improvements in transportation and public health, have also experienced high rates of movement from rural areas to major cities. And these and other poor countries have also contributed to high rates of global mobility by migrating in large numbers to the more fully modern states of Western Europe, Britain, Canada, and the United States. As a result of both international and internal migration, whole new communities and neighborhoods have arisen, and their inhabitants have not yet put down strong roots and continue to live among strangers. The long human era, when most people lived and died not far from where they and their ancestors were born, is now coming to an end. To ensure peace and security, modern states must command and mobilize huge militaries. It's not an option. The 20th century becomes the most violent and destructive in human history as a result. But even if a state is peace-loving, it still must protect itself from other states that may not share its peaceful outlook. To do so, it must match the military might of the most aggressive and powerful states, in addition to the others challenged by modernity. Modern states are inherently dangerous. The quest for material well-being and longer lives ensures that the fruit of modern science and technology would be aimed at providing prosperity, longevity, and physical well-being, as well as military capability. As a result, the vast majority of people in a modern state will be wealthier than human beings have ever been, except for the tiniest minority. And in some places, even middle-class citizens will enjoy material abundance unknown to pre-modern times. Unfortunately, as Hobbes foresaw, well-being does not breed contentment. As citizens' more immediate wants are satisfied, new desires emerge that they seek to fulfill. As productive capacity increases, citizens become less content with their current levels of consumption. When Samuel Gompers, the first president of the American Federation of Labor, was asked what the American worker wanted, more. He was right. Modern citizens do not want merely enough. They expect the pie to grow larger forever and for their own shares to grow as well. Thus, the more government accomplishes in providing for people's wants, the more the people pressure to do even better. The ever-expanding demand to provide for human welfare complements the need for security to make government ever more powerful and intrusive. And as advances are made in nutrition, sanitation, medical science, people in modern states live much longer and infant and child mortality decline. Populations will therefore grow, contributing to the problems caused by size. And now I introduce my pal.
Greetings. So since they were crafting a constitution for what was clearly a modern state, the American framers gave great credence to reason, science, and universality. The framers were, of course, deeply influenced by Hobbes and the great liberal philosophers who came after him, especially Locke, Montesquieu, and Hume. The Federalist more frequently quotes Hume and Montesquieu, but the incorporation of seminal ideas such as natural rights, consent, the primacy of security for life, liberty, and estate display their great debt to John Locke as well. The framers prided themselves on being enlightened and on freeing America from the shackles of feudalism and of founding a new political science. As Lincoln stressed, they considered the self-evident rights enunciated in the Declaration of Independence and the unstated premise upon which the Constitution was based. Their path diverged from the French because they did not aspire to transform human nature. They did not aspire to transform human beings. They accepted human nature as it was because they understood that human nature cannot be changed. However, they diverged from Hobbes by not claiming that human nature consisted of nothing but the interplay of passions. They sought to devise a form of government that both relied on a pre-modern understanding of human virtue and sought to compensate for, rather than extirpate, human failings. In Federalist 51, for example, Publius recognizes that if men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary. But men were not angels and could not be made to be so. They were passionate, self-interested, and prone to forming factions. They desired power, but they were also virtuous, thoughtful, and public-spirited, but not reliably so. To succeed, government would have to adapt to this ambivalent reality. The framers built upon human virtues and sought to check human foibles. They allowed pre-modern qualities of human life to coexist with modern ones. Humans could aspire to knowledge and progress even as they clung to religion, custom, and other non-rational beliefs and practices. The Constitution established a granular structure designed to promote deliberation, consensus, and participation without surrendering the values of stability, energy, and legitimacy, conceding, by the way, that such a government might be sometimes slow to act. Additionally, the Constitution supposes that there are some things a national government can do well and some things that it cannot do well, and therefore should not attempt at all. Some things, that is, are best left to levels of government closer to the problems at hand. To use the simplest example of what the framers meant, the federal government is demonstrably better at sending a man to the moon than it has been at improving math scores in local public schools. It's well to remember as well that the government can and must remain energetic, but it can and should do so without undermining those constitutional arrangements that have made popular representative government possible in the world's largest democracy. I should say one of the world's largest democracies, now that India has grown so big. The difficulty develops when judicial and bureaucratic excesses and congressional forms and, the difficulty develops when judicial and bureaucratic excesses and congressional inattention cause problems to be attacked with methods that distort constitutional forms and principles. Not only do those distortions threaten our liberty, but they are often ineffective as well, and therefore sap the government of its energy and tax revenue, as well as the public confidence it needs in order to govern legitimately. But this defense naturally raises an important question. If the political order the Constitution provides for is so excellent, why has confidence in the constitutional design declined in modern times? And does this decline have something to do with the drastic decline in the level of trust that citizens accord to their government? To further complicate the issue, the low level of trust, which has descended into the teens, coexists with strong public support for the notion that the federal government should do even more to improve the lives of people, often in the form of programmatic rights that only the government can secure. As James Q. Wilson astutely observed, the traditional legitimacy barrier has been broken in modern times. The citizenry and its elected representatives no longer ask two questions about a proposed policy. Is it a good idea? And is it constitutional? They are content to ask only the first question. Nor do they limit rights claims to those included in the Bill of Rights, which places the most important constraints on the federal government. Rather, they claim a right to such diverse things as health care, a safe and clean environment, and a guaranteed income that only the apparently untrustworthy government can provide, and only if it is given even more power than it already has. So Chapter 4 concludes with an examination of public policy making since the late 1960s in order to solve the mystery of how robust progressive policy expansion continued even in the absence of progressive majorities in Congress or among the voters. Public policy continues to frequently go against the constitutional grain, even though the Democratic Party dominance that undergirded the New Deal and the Great Society has waned. From 1968 to 2020, Republicans held the presidency for more years than Democrats, and divided government has dominated the Congress, yet no serious retrenchment has taken place. The key to solving the mystery is to recognize how two key aspects of modern policymaking work to hide the true costs and the practical import of what the government is actually doing. Contemporary American government is unusually opaque, conducted largely out of sight, and driven by legislation that is more often than not exceedingly long, excessively detailed, and therefore increasingly difficult for even the most well-informed citizen to understand. To take perhaps one extreme comparison, the Wagner Act of 1936 which aimed to transform American labor relations, was only 8 pages long. The Affordable Care Act of 2009, which aimed to transform health insurance, was 906 pages long. As Chris DeMuth has argued, the real price tag of expansionary American public policy is greatly understated by 2 forms of taxation evasion: regulation and deficit spending. Because the public does not see the true cost of ever more expensive and expansive federal programs, it is all the more willing to ignore the breakdown of the legitimacy barrier. This is especially true for the many citizens whose incomes do not generate any federal tax obligations. In addition, federal regulation hides the true cost of programs by shifting the burden from the federal budget, and hence from the taxpayer, to the private sector and to state and local governments. Congress has been unwilling to increase taxes since the late 60s, but has pursued several ambitious and expensive goals via regulation instead, to improve the environment, to make workplaces safer, to increase handicapped access, and myriad other policy ambitions. However, since the private sector can, for the most part, pass along the costs of compliance to consumers, the public pays, but does not know how much it is paying, or even that it's paying at all. Deficit spending has the same obfuscating effect. The public has the mistaken impression that government expansion is coming free of charge because the government does not pay for it in real time by raising everyone's taxes, but defers payment to the future through the mechanism of debt finance. It borrows money by selling bonds, taking advantage of the fact that global investors, including China, consider the United States to be a solid credit risk. But eventually, these bonds will have to be redeemed, which means that Americans are trading current pain for pain imposed on their children and their grandchildren. As of 2020, the federal debt was the highest in the nation's history, and not only in peacetime. It has now surpassed the debt incurred to pay for the Second World War. And yet congressional Democrats are currently hoping, as we write, to spend another $3.5 trillion on physical and social infrastructure. The other crucial means of hiding what the government is doing is what our colleague, Shep Melnick, calls leapfrogging. Leapfrogging occurs when either a court or an agency takes an initiative, the other branch then adds to the regulation and sends it back to the first, which in turn makes the regulation a bit more demanding. Originally devised as a means to prevent the Nixon administration from retreating from Great Society goals, leapfrogging soon outgrew its initial partisan purpose. It has now become standard operating procedure during Democratic as well as Republican administrations, as agency officials have come to treasure it as a means for implementing policies that might well prove unpopular if they had to pass Congress and be exposed to the glare of publicity. Thus, taxation evasion stealthiness is exacerbated by these successful efforts to avoid public scrutiny. And we provide a number of examples of leapfrogging at work in the book in diverse policy areas, including civil rights, environment, higher education, and special ed. Of course, the public supports racial and gender equality, better schools, environmental quality, and aid for the physically and mentally disabled. But due to the opaque interactions of courts and bureaucrats, it has no clear window into how these policies are actually implemented, or even what the policies actually are. So it falls to Congress to bring the invisible government to the light of day and curb it. Yet Congress has abdicated its duty as statutory guardian, ignoring the persistent habit of leapfrogging that circumvents the letter of the law. Its members have become so enamored of proclaiming their partisan proclivities that they have neglected the hard work of framing statutes, debating their merits, curbing the courts, and overseeing policy implementation. The United States has many attributes of a modern state. It will inevitably take on a wide variety of tasks, and those charged with performing those tasks will just as inevitably seek to maximize their discretion in doing so. And now the bureaucrats have acquired a powerful ally in the judiciary. Mindful of the possibility that federal officials might be less than faithful to their assigned roles, the framers created a key countervailing power, the Congress, hoping that the ambition of its members would drive them to fight against executive and judicial aggrandizement. The future of the Republic rests on the willingness of Congress to reassert that noble ambition. Right. Thank you.
You stole my chair, so I'll steal yours.
I stole your chair.
That's fine. Thank you both very much. There's a lot there to chew on, and really, I can't recommend this wonderful book enough. It's terribly important. I think maybe the way to start is to ask each of you about a point in your part of that talk that I think might be a challenge to the other and might be something we want to think about. Marc, you suggested that the Constitution has the character it does because it recognizes the United States to be a distinctly modern society. And yet, one of the strongest critiques of the Constitution, or at least one of the most frequent critiques of the Constitution, is precisely that it is not modern enough, that it's a relic, that it's 18th century parchment trying to govern a 21st century society. Are those critics just wrong about the Constitution? Is it more modern than they are, or do they have a point that it was modern when it was written, but...
Well, you know, it forces me to attack one of my mentors, Samuel P. Huntington, right? Antique Polity, Modern Society. It's a great book. But he's
it's a great title.
And and he's especially, but he's wrong. I mean, the convention itself, the deliberations there, I think really do show that there was great appreciation that the U.S. would be a modern state, probably eventually a great state, and that this particular mechanisms they came up with, often after a great deal of contention, right? Madison didn't want federalism. It's just that each of these attributes happen to fit beautifully with our modern difficulties, right? It's a really hard country to rule. And if it bites off too much at the national level, it's going to dissipate. So federalism, what a great idea. The Electoral College, which was created for the wrong reasons, perhaps. Well, not for the wrong reasons, but for other reasons. But what a great idea that presidential contests cannot just concentrate on mobilizing your base, right? If it was national elections, the Democrats would spend all their time on the two coasts and Illinois, right? And the greater Chicago, they don't care about Illinois. That's part of my critique of Democrats. They don't care about Illinois. Electoral college, right? And actually something I learned from Yuval, because I've been reading his book, is it also actually is mostly a good thing that the elections hinge so much on the swing states, because it's in the swing states that you really see the key issues, the key problems, the key differences broached. And they should actually have a privilege. I didn't have that thought until I learned that from you. So, electoral, I could go on, but you see my point. That these institutions, you know, did they have the total gift of foresight? No, and we've had terrific, I think mostly excellent amendments. I'm not so sure about the direct election of senators, but you guys can convince me that that's a great idea.
Yeah, I have a thought on that. you know, in some ways, the most important members of the convention were Hamilton and Madison. In terms of their direct participation and also the key decisions they helped to influence. But there was one proposal. It was called the Council of Revision. It would have created a council made up of members of the court, Supreme Court, and the president. Its responsibility would have been to vet every piece of legislation coming out of the Congress and giving it a thumbs up or a thumbs down, or editing it, amending it.
The states too?
No, this is just the federal.
This is just the Congress.
Madison was so enamored of this idea, he introduced it 3 times. And after getting defeated the 3rd time, he finally gave up. Hamilton, for his part, confessed during the convention, you know, and he prefaced this confession with a remark. I think some gentlemen here have changed their minds on this question recently, but will not admit it. And that is that the states were a problem. And he says, I'm not going to push this. I'm just going to tell you what I think we should do, even though I know you're not going to do it. We need to we need to redraw all the boundaries of all the states to make them of equal population and keep doing that in the future. Then the states are not a problem. But when Rhode Island has 2 members in the Senate and Virginia has 2 members in the Senate, that's a problem. But then he said, but I know you're not going to like this idea, so I'm just going to describe it and then forget about it. And that's what he did. So there was some real doubts about whether this was going to work. And everybody had their fingers crossed.
How do you think, Dennis, about the core critique of the progressives that whether it had worked or not, the rise of the modern industrial economy meant that it needed to change?
Well, what we say in the book, I would stand behind. It was the United States was already a modern state. It didn't become a modern state in 1898. It was already a modern state. It just got bigger and bigger and bigger. So if they and they knew it was going to get bigger. They didn't know how it would get bigger, but they knew that Spain and France and England were not going to hang on to their colonies in North America. They would have to give them up eventually. And of course, Jefferson plucked them. It was in office at just the right moment to snag the entire North American continent below Canada. So, yeah, they knew what was coming, and they were not naive about how difficult it would be to govern a country of this size and of this quality, right? I mean, the American citizens were not like English subjects. They were truculent. they were short-tempered, and they were demanding. But that, you know, you go to sea with the crew you got, not the crew you want. You build a country for the people you got, not necessarily the people you might want.
Can I just chime in one more thing?
Of course.
Right, the Interstate Commerce Clause is a great idea. Right, they weren't that naive. There was going to be a lot of difficulty with the economy. And so the progressives, in a certain sense, you know, they were right that we had to adapt to the realities of modern industrialism. But the Constitution is no barrier. We have the SEC, we have the FTC. I'm all for them. They should behave, FTC should behave better, but that's another story. Antitrust division, I think we've done pretty well.
Some of the changes you point to, and maybe especially in the portion of the case you just made to us here, Dennis, some of the changes in the practice of constitutionalism that you point to have been with us for a long time. You know, to worry about the change in attitude about the role of government that began in the 19-teens and 20s and 30s is to say that we've been doing this wrong for 100 years. If the legitimacy barrier or the sense of the possible, the boundary we face has been broken for 100 years, aren't we really living with a different constitution?
Well, we're living with a different government. And, you know, the problem you point to is a real one. The public has gotten used to the idea that the federal government can, you know, do whatever it feels like doing as long as it gets a majority in the Congress and the Senate. And then, well, you know, somebody will sue and we'll worry about it later if it's unconstitutional. I mean, that's an unfortunate reality that we live with. And one of the, one of our aims in the book is to try to get people to think a little differently about the question of what the Constitution means.
Can I have a moment? Because I finally have it. I disagree with Yuval about once a decade. Well, I'm disagreeing with him here. The polling on trust in government, respect for the executive, was really high in as late as the 1950s, early 60s. This really is a new problem. Mm-hmm. New, I mean, I'm old enough to think things since the 1960s.
Well, look, respect for Congress in the 19th century was probably about as low as it is now.
Probably.
It rose after World War II and the Depression.
I've never seen any data.
Yeah, we don't know. There's no Gallup polling for the 19th century.
You think trust in government was low?
Maybe I just take Mark Twain to speak for the 19th century, but trust in government is not really a classic American trait, is it?
That's a discussion for another time because, after all, Mark Twain coined the term Gilded Age, which is such a terrible stereotype. I love Mark Twain, but he doesn't speak for America entirely.
But you take the problem, the challenge to the Constitution to be really a contemporary problem.
Yeah, I do.
And why is it then now that all of these law professors, all of these academics, and in some ways the public in general has lost confidence in the Constitution?
That's a tall order. I think partly it's a question of, when I say leadership, I don't mean government leadership, I mean college faculty leadership, high schools. In other words, the socialization problem goes very deep. I mean, if elementary school and high school teachers are learning their American history from Howard Zinn, that's, that's maybe a deeper problem than the Congress.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I think what progressives dislike about the Constitution is simply that the Constitution puts limits on what the national government can do, or slows down the process of making decisions. And progressives are eager to transform America, fundamentally transform America, as President Obama said. I wish some reporter had asked him exactly how do you want to transform America? But progressives could answer that question. I think they don't like to answer that question because they suspect that people wouldn't like the answer. So stealth government's fine with them.
Among the unpopular institutions you defend in the book is the party system. Even the framers of the Constitution didn't like parties.
They didn't like it, no.
And then they went out and formed them.
And they immediately went out and formed them, right? Help us understand the place of the party system in American constitutionalism.
Well, okay, I'm a student of Wilson Carey McWilliams, and I learned this from him, so I don't want to claim any originality. The constitutional system and the formal system lacks one thing. It doesn't have much in the way of encouraging emotional attachment, right? Lincoln recognized that in the perpetuation speech, right? I mean, this is dry stuff. And what the great thing about the parties is until a few decades ago. Now the party, now I could abolish the party system.
I was going to say, what is the great thing about the party?
It's completely undermined its own purpose. The purpose it served, and there was no great theorist of this. The best is Martin Van Buren, but he's not really a theorist of it, even him. He understood it the best, is that, first of all, it's rooted in locality, because our elections are held, our election of national offices is done through the states and localities. And that allows parties to mirror federalism in that they are rooted in state and localities. And then you had this means for choosing particularly the president of the National Convention, which was nothing but a opportunity for this, I call them the barons at the state and local level, to bargain with one another, maybe even deliberate. Who knows? We weren't there. But the whole process of choosing the president was rooted in very serious discussion among thoughtful professionals who themselves had to answer to their publics. And that was just a better way to do things. You know, we had James Buchanan. I'm not claiming that the party system was infallible. That would be absurd.
Yeah, no, I feel the same way. In a democratic government, first of all, there has to be a way to create a majority. Otherwise, you end up with these ineffective, Western European parliamentary style governments where, the Nazis are marching and they still can't get a majority. Oh, sorry, louder. Yeah. So the party system makes majority rule possible. I mean, I think it's really that simple. For all its faults, you do have to get, a majority of your own voters to attach themselves to a candidate. And if they won't do that, then you have nominated the wrong candidate. And you'll be more careful next time.
Dennis, you ended your part of the talk with a kind of rousing call for Congress to reassert itself. The idea that Congress would need to be reminded to reassert itself might have been strange to Madison and Hamilton.
Right.
Their assumption was all the institutions would be very ambitious, and Congress in particular might be even overly ambitious. How did we get to a place where Congress has lost its own ambition for power?
The Congress was going to be the vortex, and they worried that it would suck everything in, right? Well, we don't have to worry about that anymore, right? The Congress is, now why? Well, I mean, partly is the country is divided very, very evenly between Democrats and Republicans, or at least in ways that allow for the Congress to be, for either party to have some difficulty in putting together a solid, reliable majority. But that's a recent problem, and it's not going to, I don't think it's a structural problem. I don't think it's going to be with us forever. But it's currently definitely a problem. I mean, the Congress has a very hard time moving in any direction. And when its victories, it's time to bring out the parades just because they finally pass a budget, which should be the easiest thing for them to do.
Mark, how do you think about what's happened in Congress?
Okay, well, again, confession time. The way I'm thinking about Congress is is influenced by Phil Wallach and you, because in your new book, I love your section on Congress, because he actually has some practical ideas. Can I steal them for this?
I stole them from Phil Wallach, so they're all yours.
Yuval really, and I think probably a lot of this is in conversations with Phil. How do you make an institution more ambitious for itself? Right? Federalist 51 is the document, and how do you do it? I had no idea how to do it, but you guys, you concentrate on really resuscitating the committees. That's the key idea I discovered, because if the committees become more important and the leadership less important, then people develop institutional responsibilities for their bailiwicks.
Right.
And they think about them, and they may even listen to members of the minority members of the committee. This was very important. I studied the passage of the big environmental acts of the 70s, and the minority council was one of the key players because he was so thoughtful, and the majority listened to him. So anyway, read his book, read his new book, since we're throwing favors around.
I want to open things up for questions here, but as you think about your questions, let me put to you just a quandary that anybody who talks about the Constitution before audiences of younger Americans faces now. The basic question of how do you think about this document written in the shadow of slavery, and how can we take it seriously now, given the way in which it treated that question or avoided that question or its authors thought about it. How do you answer that question now?
Oh, well, you know, Lincoln answered it. So I'm just aping him. I mean, he understood that Georgia and South Carolina weren't going to join. You know, we start with a fundamental political problem. Do you want Georgia and South Carolina in the Union or not? Well, if you want them in the Union, you are going to have to protect, to some extent, the institution that they are wedded to. And therefore, it's very important to notice the exact language of the Constitution. The word slavery never appears. There's never a defense of the idea of humans as property. All the Constitution says is that where it is practiced, there will be the protection of the fugitive slave, returning fugitive slaves. The rest is kind of
Persons.
Persons held in servitude. Persons held in servitude.
No, persons held in service.
Never actually says property.
Right. No, of course, this also included apprentices who got paid to come over from England, and they had to work off their...
You know, I just really regret that slavery ever happened in this country. It is an evil of perhaps almost the greatest level. But there it was. What are you going to do about it? And I think the Constitution elides those problems out of necessity. But it was really necessity.
Dennis, wasn't that William Lloyd Garrison's reason for burning the Constitution, that it just puts up with slavery?
Well, yeah, that it was a slavery document. But others in his movement, I think, had a better ideas. Frederick Douglass, most importantly, he changed his mind about the Constitution. He thought about it. He realized, no, this is not a pro-slavery document. This is a document that puts that assumes that slavery will go away, and does not want to give it any sanction by even mentioning it. So it's persons held to servitude.
Let's take questions in the room if folks have them.
Ask the people to identify themselves, please.
Very good. Please tell us who you are and put a question mark at the end of your question. Let's start back here.
Yes, my name is Roger Cochetti, and one of the features of the Constitution that I would submit is distinct, perhaps unique, was recognizing something that the framers called the press, and sometimes called the fourth branch of government. It accorded to this private sector institution rights that seem to be greater than the rights of citizens. And, it certainly singled them out distinctly and accorded them a category of rights that were separate from the rights that citizens have to free speech. And yet, it's hard to imagine that the framers could have anticipated the landscape of electronic media that we face today, and even understanding who is the press and who's not. Much of this has only happened in the last 25 years, but you have anomalous situations now in which many people would say that Neil Sheehan and Charles Sulzberger in the New York Times are absolutely protected with the release of the Pentagon Papers. This was a right of the press, and Chelsea Manning and Julian Assange were scoundrels and just private individuals breaking the law and committing espionage. So trying to navigate the barrier in a world that's dominated by TikTok, Facebook, YouTube, where anybody can address everybody, where somebody in China can address everybody in the United States and say, I'm sorry, George Washington died today. Everybody needs to rally behind James Madison because Washington died when he didn't. How do you all imagine we navigate is this sort of Potter Stewart? I know pornography when I see it, but don't ask me why, because I know what is the press and what is not the press when I see it. But what views do you guys have on the issue of updating our definition, our concept of either the press or rights of the press to the modern technology? And that will change even as we go into the future.
Well, the press at the founding was pretty scurrilous, possibly worse than the average newspaper these days. But this is not a problem that has a solution. You either have freedom of speech or you don't have freedom of speech. And the effort to silence the press in the Sedition Act blew up in everybody's face. And I think that sort of taught a lesson that this isn't going to work. Because a state legislature will define defamation in one way, and then another state will define it in another way, and you just have everybody's going to court. And so,
my issue is, what is the press?
Well, the press is, all those commercial enterprises that try to communicate the news to people, and it's not just papers anymore, but it hasn't been papers exclusively for quite some time. So I don't think, I'm not sure that Facebook makes that much of a difference, to tell you the truth.
I think I'm a little more of your persuasion about the horrors of TikTok, Facebook, et cetera. But the problem is not the Constitution, right? The Constitution could be very widely interpreted to accommodate some serious thinking about that. And also, the Constitution is not responsible for some pretty stupid Supreme Court decisions. I don't think the framers expected the Supreme Court to be so ambitious and so willing to legislate. So I'm thinking of the Sullivan decision as one that I really abhor. Actually, that's in the other direction. I'm ready to give the press a harder time on libel. They libel people all the time. That standard is so unbelievably high. So not all my critique comes from a civil libertarian perspective, but I don't really want to blame it on the Constitution. And I don't know what to do.
Let's take another question up here in front.
Hi, Lauren Seabell. I'm here at AEI. This question is for either or both of you, but it's
Well, you hear from both of us.
something that Professor Hale started with was that the founders built a form of government that relied on a pre-modern understanding of virtue, but still understood that men couldn't be relied upon to be virtuous, and tried to kind of combine that with progress. And I'm curious whether you think that you've done a good job of combining these things.
All right, let me see if I'm not sure I quite understand your question. Did they believe that Americans were virtuous enough to be able to run to be able to govern themselves? Is that the question?
Did the pre-modern understanding of virtue, that this type of virtue that maybe we didn't have sufficiently, but need and the government could help cultivate to some extent, have we done a good job of that and balancing that virtue that we need with our efforts toward progress?
Oh, I see what you mean. One way to see this happening is in watching how presidents and other public officials talk to the public. And sometimes they do that well, and more often than not, they do that badly. But you can speak to the public in a way that reminds them that there are serious moral questions that they have to decide based on how they vote. We saw this during the Civil Rights Movement, where I think Lyndon Johnson rose to the occasion of making civil rights a serious moral challenge to the public. But this isn't the sort of thing that's going to happen all the time, obviously.
So I want to get back to your pre-modern virtue aspect of the question. Something that I learned by reading people like Madison more carefully, they fully understood that pre-modern virtues had to undergird the system. The most articulate and the least appreciated of the founders was George Washington. Read his farewell address.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Our politics depends on virtue. Virtue depends on education, and more profoundly on religion. So there was, I think, a very solid understanding. What they also understood is that the national government, only in the cases like what Dennis put, has any role in this. Right? Can you imagine you want a Department of Civic Virtue? I mean, civic virtue is a very difficult thing to cultivate. And here it's all de Tocqueville. You have to cultivate it locally. And then people learn about what politics actually means from participating locally, then they can make what Madison later on calls an honorable determinations about who to choose. So, I mean, your question is so deep that I'm only scratching, or we're scratching, but that's.
Let's take it up here, Mike Riva.
I yell so loud I don't need a mic. I'll use my microphone. Mike Riva, Scalia Law School. I have two questions, but they're friendly and they're brief, okay? I think there's a point of agreement among all of us. The Constitution isn't perfect, but it's a whole lot better than what we have now. So that leads me to my question about the title. I understand the Ben Franklin allusion. I understand the sort of impulse of saying, let's defend sort of Republican government against Democratic crazies. But I think our problems, and I think you agree, I mean, it reach much beyond that particular line of attack, right? So when you thought about the title, did you think about maybe recovering constitutionalism might be a better title? And my second question is, in some respects, this hasn't worked very well, right? And I appreciate sort of the impulse of saying, let's fix Congress, or let's sort of get Congress back into the game, and I'm all in favor of the Phil Wallach program, right? Hail Jamie Whitten. Let's have the committees back. But I don't think that'll solve our problem. So my simple question is, if you had one proposal for constitutional amendment, what would it be, regardless of whether it could pass or not? And please don't say the Equal Rights Amendment.
You want to go first?
Well, no, but I'll. The reason we use that, the reason we use Ben Franklin is because he's right. You have to keep it. You, the citizen. That's what he's saying to her, or to him. There's two versions. It's a republic, if you can keep it. Meaning, it's not going to be easy. It's not an easy kind of government to keep. Much better to be governed by a monarch, because then, you know, he'll just crack down on everybody who gets in the way, and, you know, life goes on. Keeping the republic is a challenge to citizens, and that's we intended it to be that. This is your problem.
I guess.
This is our problem, and we have to solve it.
So I have my fantasy amendments, right? Ban cell phones. That would really be my favorite, because my students don't talk to each other. But in a serious vein, I think I really have to agree with Dennis. We're looking at some kind of civic recovery. It has to be in the elementary schools. It has to be in neighborhoods and cities before it's ever going to bubble up to the nation. The great thing about the Constitution is it allows for it. That's why I'm a great fan of the Constitution. The Constitution doesn't put any barriers in terms of political science, teaching students what they should know about the political world. It doesn't ban English teachers from assigning serious books. Right? Michael, that's you got to the deepest level, but don't blame the Constitution. I don't need any constitutional reforms. Sensible parents would keep cell phones out of the hands of their kids. Why aren't parents more sensible? That's not a constitutional matter.
Yes, right.
Let's take one last question in the back, yeah. Behind you, Liz.
You know who that is?
I'm Adam White. I work here at AEI. Adam White at AEI. Here, most of my work focuses on the courts, and you alluded to them briefly, but I would love to hear a little bit more. And since you have mentioned the Federalist a few times, maybe I'll put it this way. Hamilton explained to us that the courts have neither force nor will, but merely judgment. But Madison wrote that every part of government has to have a will of its own. So how should we think of the judicial will in an American republic?
Well, at the moment, right, the key to the judicial will is, to some extent, restoration, right, of a sounder understanding of the Constitution. And that, unfortunately, can't just, so conservative has a new meaning. I think, let me talk about something positive for a matter, right? The Supreme Court will make a huge modification, if not reject the precedent of Chevron, right? It's going to do it. That's an attack on stealth government. If stealth government is one of the things that is our bête noire, I wish it was also being attacked by more deliberation in Congress, but let's start somewhere. So in those areas, in that area, administrative law, I think the judiciary is exercising its will because it's thinking about the Constitution. I just mean the majority. I don't see the minority stepping up to the plate very much.
So Chevron is a judicial doctrine to begin with. So in a sense, the courts are fixing a court's
Yeah, they're
mistake.
fixing them. It's not
Is
the
there a
court,
role
yeah.
for the courts in pushing the executive and Congress to do things they aren't otherwise doing? Is that an appropriate use of their will?
Yeah, because if Chevron properly, and if, as I hope the decision comes out the way I expect, Congress is going to have to deal with hard questions. Well, how did we get to a point where they can't pass some kind of immigration reform? This is rocket science to control the border and yet have some sort of lawful procedure to allow people to immigrate. Of all the problems we face, and this could be the turning point in the election, but it just doesn't, I mean, we have really much more intractable problems than immigration, and yet Congress can't even deal with that one.
Right. Yeah, no, nothing to add, really. This is, again, this is a government in which the people choose their legislators, and the legislators have a responsibility, and if they don't fulfill that responsibility, then they need to be defeated. But that's obviously a very difficult problem when so many members of Congress are sort of not showing up to work.
Well, there are a few more AEI things we could end on than to call on Congress to do its job. So it's a great place to stop. Dennis Hale and Marc Landy, thank you very much for being here and for this great book. Let's just give them a hand and thank you all.
Thank you.